The global economy is interconnected. What happens in one region is felt on the other side of the world. So the war in Gaza will have an impact. The question is, just how big will it be? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, markets don't like shocks or uncertainty, but that's become commonplace through the COVID pandemic and a war in Ukraine. What will the latest major conflict mean for the global economy?
The world is still living through the economic aftermath of some serious shocks. The International Monetary Fund estimates COVID will cost $12.5 trillion through 2024, about half the size of the US economy, while the OECD think tank has put a minimum $2.8 trillion price tag on the war on Ukraine for lost output. The war is also a significant factor in the current cost of living crisis. Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas, so those prices shot up, while Ukraine is one of the biggest suppliers of grain worldwide. While neither Israel nor Gaza are economic superpowers, they're surrounded by oil-producing powerhouses. After the Hamas attack on October 7th, oil prices spiked and have been volatile since, rising further as tensions have increased. In the short and medium term, this is the main economic concern. The World Bank has warned that if the conflict escalates in the region the same way it did in the 1970s, oil could reach $150 a barrel. That would be the highest price ever recorded.
There's uncertainty about whether this is going to spread further to the whole region, which could impact very much on global economic growth.
So just as the world's economies are starting to show signs of recovery, could another big shock be waiting on the horizon?
Well, let's meet our guests. In London, Hilary Ingham, Professor of Economics at Lancaster University, and joining us from Rabat, we have Abdelmalek Alaoui, President of the Moroccan Institute for Strategic Intelligence. And here in the studio with me, Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor and a board member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Abdelmalek, I'll come to you first. The war in Ukraine has already had a spectacular impact on the global economy. What kind of impact do you think the Israel-Hamas conflict might have?
Well, I think everybody's expecting a massive shock. The war in the region and the ongoing tragic events are like a black box to an airplane just after a plane crash. It unveils a lot of things that were hidden, a lot of disorders in the global order, and a lot of things that the international community did not want to look at for over 2 decades. And when it completely exploded, now we have a tremendous polarization of narratives. We have competing point of views between the global South, the Islamic community, and the Western world. So we have all the recipes to create the next big catastrophe on all sectors that we can imagine, whether it's supply chains to the price of commodities. This is going to be a global mess.
Hilary, how worried should we be then?
I think it really depends, because I think at the minute it's relatively contained. So I think the impacts elsewhere, whilst they will be felt, I do agree with that. I think it depends how far it goes. I think how far it stretches and whether it ultimately becomes an Iran-US conflict, disagreement, that would be a far more serious affair.
Vicky, another war in an energy-producing region of the world. I mean, right now, this is probably the last thing the global economy needs.
Indeed, especially given that things have stabilized and we're looking at inflation dropping in many parts of the world, which is good news. But now we have already gas prices in Europe going up very significantly. There have been some issues about Egypt being able to import some of the gas from Israel, which apparently has stopped doing, and then that gets converted into LNG and sent across. So that has already had an impact, and it could, of course, continue. So there are other energy issues, of course, because the wider area that we're looking at is quite a substantial producer of oil and gas, of course. And then we have the World Bank, which just in the last 24 hours is warning about the possibility of oil prices going back up to $150 a barrel. If that were to happen, then we can look at the world economy and see that it's probably going to go back into recession.
So as we speak, a barrel of Brent crude is $88, give or take a few cents. The prediction might be that if this were to spiral out of control and other parties get involved, we could be looking at not far off double a barrel.
That's what they think is a possibility. It's one of the scenarios. It's not the one that they're necessarily saying is going to happen, and there are loads of other scenarios they're looking at. So there could be some benign outcomes where we don't see that happening. But it's interesting that so far, oil has not increased to the extent that people had anticipated. It sort of edged over 90 and people started talking about possibly $100 a barrel, but that seems to have receded quite significantly. A lot will depend on what Saudi Arabia and others do and what also happens with Iran.
I want to come to you again, Abdelmalek. The World Bank recently warned of a dual energy shock if this conflict escalates. Just spell out for us what they meant by that and what it would mean to the average consumer around the world.
Well, actually, the World Bank, as well as the IMF and all multilateral organizations based in DC, have been struggling with a big paradox. From one side, their shareholders and people who are lending them money, which is globally the Western world, are pushing very hard so that their agenda turns into renewables, whereas the countries where they're supposed to finance projects are very much into reducing poverty and still working on the social agenda. So the view from the Global South is that these institutions are no longer relevant when it comes to facing the big energy shortage that is going to come, because simply the kind of investment that they want to do are not targeted towards the real needs that you have in the Global South. So this dual energy shock comes from really an economic trilemma, because rich countries from the north want to impose an agenda that is geared towards climate change and renewables, and countries that are in the south, which only, and especially in Africa, which only accounts for 4% of bad emissions when it comes to the environment, they still need capital to fight the social agenda. So these are two narratives that are competing, that are very complicated to reconcile. So this is the kind of shock that we're looking at.
And of course, it comes on top of everything we've seen from Russia's war in Ukraine. Yeah,
but look at it. If you take it from our perspective as rising and emerging countries, we've seen a lot of fuss about the Ukraine war, which is absolutely normal. But because this country is located very close to Europe, and when I spoke about double standards and about energy, one critical example is the case of Germany. For 15 years, Germany has been lecturing the whole world, and especially Africa and Asia, about climate change. But when the war in Ukraine broke out, it only took them 24 hours to reuse the coal stations in order to face possible shortage of gas. So what's happening right now, and I think this is a pivotal moment and really an epiphany for everyone, is that for the first time, there is an alternative voice coming from the South that is rising. It's not using any filters or traditional medias because it has social medias. And there is a global awakening that some of the injunctions that were coming to the South from the Western world are no longer valid, because we believe that those guys are just giving lessons, but not applying them at home.
Hilary, am I right in thinking that the price of oil is the main driving factor here in terms of where this conflict could go with regard to the world economy?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Vicky did say that the prediction is it could reach $150 a barrel. And that's the figure I've seen as well. So I think that is the main concern. I mean, there's other things as well. So, for example, if you take the Israeli economy, it has quite a vibrant tourist sector. That is going to be, non-viable, really, because most airlines are not flying there. So there are a lot of things that are going to happen, but everything really is going to be about oil, because throughout the world now, energy is sort of key to so many things.
And Hilary, that figure of $150 per barrel, what would that spell it out for us in real terms on the forecourts at the petrol pumps? I mean, what would that do to the knock-on effect on the customers. We're paying, what, £1.60 approximately a litre for unleaded petrol in the United Kingdom right now. So that would surely see prices surge.
I mean, it depends how much the companies, the petrol stations would act as a buffer zone, but I think you would see it going over £2 in the UK.
I'm going to come to you, Vicky. Are world economies, European leaders in particular, looking at the conflict in the Middle East very selfishly? They've spent so long trying to get inflation down. Some of them have succeeded. Some of them are not doing so great. The United Kingdom, 6.7% inflation. Do you think some people are looking at this very selfishly and hoping that it ends very, very quickly so that they can kind of get back on track as to their own economic steer?
Well, I'm pretty certain that everyone hopes that it will end pretty quickly because the humanitarian issue is so significant right now, and we're watching it on our screens as far as that information is available. So, ending violence is always a thing everyone hopes for. But in terms of growth, it's absolutely true that the energy factor has been very significant in terms of pushing inflation up. And we've seen countries like Germany reduce their energy consumption quite significantly in order to react to what's been going on. Yes, of course, they've been using lignite now, which they weren't using before, and they've closed their nuclear power stations down, so they don't have a huge amount of options. They're getting a lot of LNG in. But the latest data that has just come out of Europe shows that not just Germany, which saw a decline in GDP in the last quarter, is affected by this, but on average, the Eurozone saw also a decline in GDP of 0.1% in the last quarter, which means that the impact, even the earlier impact of reacting, if you like, to the high energy costs by policymakers has been having a dampening effect on growth. So if you add to that any extra pressures that may come, then obviously you have to revise your views of what's going to happen to the world economy as a result, and Europe in particular.
Abdelmalek, I want to ask you about Iran. We've seen a slight thawing of relations between Iran and the United States in recent weeks and months, unfreezing of Iranian assets. We've seen American prisoners being released. If that relationship were to worsen again, what would that do to oil prices around the world?
Well, I think mechanically oil prices will go up. It's already on the trend of reaching $150 per barrel. But I think what it reveals is much more deeper, because in this great battle between East and West, Saudi Arabia clearly has become the referee. So all eyes are on Riyadh, because Riyadh made a lot of diplomatic moves that were considered as very bold when they resumed the relationship with Iran. And Riyadh is today the power broker in the region, because in no point in history a country has had that immense financial capabilities, and that even pushed the Saudis to invest in a lot of iconic companies. I mean, one of the prime shareholders of Tesla today is the Saudi government. So I think that a lot of looks are heading towards Riyadh and their attitude, and this will condition the way the US will deal with Iran, because they will have to keep some kind of balance with Saudi Arabia, because the price of oil will depend first and foremost of the Saudi attitude.
And just tell me, do you genuinely feel the Saudis might have some influence over the Iranians in terms of keeping them out of all of this, were it to get on the brink of escalation?
Absolutely. I think it was a massive diplomatic win for the Iranians to resume diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia, but not only. The Iranians were accepted into the BRICS club during summer with a massive push by the Saudis. So this means some kind of respectability in terms of international scenery and coming back into the concert of nations. So they don't want to lose this kind of competitive advantage, because if they have Saudi Arabia against them, and once again, this deal was brokered by China. China was the middleman in all of this. So this tells us a lot about the center of gravity of the new geopolitics. It's heading towards the east. We have players that are asserting their new position. And while the war was unfolding in Gaza, Xi Jinping was hosting his Road and Belt Summit with heads of state from all over the world. So this tells us a lot about what's happening and who are the countries that can exert some kind of leverage over Iran right now.
Well, Kristalina Georgieva is managing director of the IMF, and this is what she had to say recently.
You expand the circle and you look at the neighboring countries, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan. There, the channels of impact are already visible. You have tourism-dependent countries. Uncertainty is a killer for tourist inflows.
Hilary, you mentioned tourism earlier on. Just talk to me about the economic impacts of all of this, because, you know, there are so many people all over the world who will be obviously watching and following news events, and the likelihood of them wanting to book holidays to that region, I would imagine in 2024, tourism is going to suffer massively.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you have to remember that it's not so long ago that people couldn't travel anyway because of the restrictions during the pandemic. And when the world opened up again, people did want to go, and they spent money on holidays in large amounts. And of course, the region we're talking about has got some very, very attractive tourist destinations. And as I said, for Israel, it's 5% of GDP. And whilst that might seem like quite a small percentage, it's very significant in terms of that country's overall income. So I think, you know, tourism will be disrupted. Again, you know, Egypt is a very important country for tourism, and they depend very heavily on it. Now, obviously, they're right on the border with Gaza. There's issues about whether relief transport can get in and foreign nationals can get out. So is that country going to be considered safe? I think it's going to be very different in the coming months to what we've seen recently in terms of tourist journeys.
And that's an awful lot of money, isn't it? I mean, for the Israelis to be looking at losing 5% of their GDP potentially, I mean, that's enormous.
Well, it is enormous. And then, of course, the other losses come because they're drafting people into the army. And if they're, you know, in the army, they're not undertaking productive activities. So that will have a dampening effect as well.
Vicky, that's a very good point, isn't it? 300,000 people, reservists, have been drafted into the Israeli Defense Forces. All of these men and women, predominantly in their 20s and 30s, have day jobs. So they're not fully committed soldiers or combatants, are they? And that amount of people has effectively been taken out of the workforce.
It's always a problem when that happens, of course. I mean, you've seen also what's happening even in Russia, where they have had to draft in loads more people, and not just from the prisons, which they have supposedly been using as a way to add to the numbers. But yes, when you divert activity to defence, then that can be a negative. On the other hand, while you're spending more possibly on weapons or even, you know, production of weaponry itself rather than importing it, then that tends to add strangely to GDP in the short term. So you have to just watch, you know, over a period of time. Obviously, if you harm sectors which have high growth, high productivity, high innovation, Israel in particular, of course, in terms of IT and digital has been doing incredibly well internationally in the competitiveness sort of tables. If you take some of that away, then obviously this is going to be a problem for the growth of the economy in the longer term. However long, of course, this lasts will influence also what happens to the economy more generally. If it is short, then obviously the impact is less.
Abdelmalek, I want to ask you about the reconstruction of Gaza. I mean, we're seeing terrible images on our TV screens every single day of death and destruction on an industrial scale. Talk to me about the eventual rebuild and reconstruction. I mean, how much of an international effort is it going to take to get Gaza back off its knees again?
Well, I don't think it will be an issue of numbers or raising money. You have GCC countries that will absolutely be ready to pitch in and to contribute and to give money. Qatar has been funding Gaza for years with the authorization of the international community and with the authorization of Israel. So it's not a question of numbers. It's going to be a question of when and how. Because as Einstein said, you know, the first sign of madness is when you do over and over again the same thing then you expect a different result. What we are seeing right now unfold is that we had some terrorist actions that happened, but that triggered a full-blown scale war. It doesn't work to stop terrorism. So the scenario that a lot of experts are fearing is to have this zone become the Vietnam of Israel because of this asymmetric fight that they will have, which will completely block operations to reconstruct. If you want to reconstruct, you need peace, and you need solid foundations and solid grounds in order to rebuild the whole city. All the rest, getting money for Palestinians and getting money for Palestinians from the rich neighboring countries will not be an issue at all. We're talking about a small territory, not a lot of people, around 2 million people. This is something that is totally manageable when it comes to money. The only issue will be of how, when, and whether it will be possible in the near future.
Hilary, just talk to me about the Palestinian economy. I mean, it was extremely weak as it was before Israel's actions. How on earth does it come back from this?
Well, it's very, very difficult. I mean, it was a very poor economy, but obviously, as has just been said, it has rich nations that will be prepared to put money into it. But at this moment in time, there really isn't anything to be done. I mean, the most important thing is that somehow peace is broken in this region between those countries, because without that, we can't go forward.
Vicky, Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, he is a finance man, a money man all his life. Have you been surprised at how pro-Israel he has been through all of this?
What the government, I think, is doing is trying to say that there was a legitimate reason for the incursion, if you like, after the Hamas attack. They don't want to be drawn too much, I think, down the sort of everything we've been hearing on the ceasefire route. And you've seen that happen also in relation to the opposition, which has been very careful about this. And we know Sir Keir Starmer here in the UK, who runs the Labour Party, has been attacked for that. But it is really interesting. We talked just a few seconds ago about the economies and reconstruction and so on. There is another issue about the Europeans and their reluctance to perhaps become particularly involved, and that is migration, where there has been, of course, already an issue in the region, in Eastern Mediterranean region, with Palestinian migration. And the concern that we've seen in Europe, where there have been serious splits between countries in terms of who wants to accept more migrants from wherever, and who wants to really be quite sort of strict about allowing their borders to be flooded by people coming in. And that is seen perhaps as a new area from which, we already know there are so many Palestinians, of course, in exile right now, but more perhaps wanting to do the route, which, via Turkey, of course, which is, has happened before or in different ways, and come into Europe. So I think there is a little bit of a worry about that. So I suspect they're all being very, very careful in their pronouncements as a result of that.
Thanks, Vicky. Abdelmalek, my final question goes to you. Do you think that's a concern for many European leaders watching on, seeing what's happening in the Middle East and worrying about even more migration into Europe, that they're selfishly worried about that?
Absolutely. This is like the number one thing on their agenda. And if you look at it from the African perspective and how we see Europe, you have 500 million wealthy people who scream and shout about 1 million migrants, as it happened in 2016. In Africa, we're 1.4 billion people, and we have 18 million migrants every year that we have to deal with. So this is an issue that Europe will have to solve. But given the intensity of the polarization and of their political landscape, no leader in Europe wants to address the question of migrants seriously. And at the same time, they are trying to change the value chain and bring back some of the industry in Europe. So this is a case that is very complicated. And if you add on top of that, the fact that a lot of European leaders are absolutely terrified to see some of the violence in the Middle East be exported in their soil, in their territories. For the last 2 weeks in France, you've had airports being shut down for 6 or 7 times, the Palace of Versailles being shot. In Belgium, you've had alerts, this will have a tremendous impact on tourism. When you see that a lot of European countries are receiving tens of millions of tourists every year who will not come if they think that there is a reasonable terrorist attack that might happen on their soil. So all of this is the result of the lack of a unified voice in Europe and the lack of leadership when it comes to external policy. I mean, they were not even able to find a convergent way between Ursula von der Leyen and the head of European diplomacy. So I don't see things getting better in the months to come. I even see more polarization, more right-wing government coming and rising in Europe, which will only create the situation even worse.
Abdelmalek, Hilary, Vicky, thank you all for your input. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.